My name is Ron Days. I'm a native of St. Helena Island, South Carolina, in Beaufort County. And because I am a Gullah Geechee native, I am a man of the waterways. Waters were always around us. The water influences our language. Our speechways, like labyrinthine waterways flowing in and out of the marshes and the rivers. I grew up seeing people crabbing and fishing, shrimping, and shucking oysters, etc., all of the waterways around us. And the music of Gullah Geechee people also is highly influenced, I'd like to think, by the waterways. It's a part of our history. The rhythms of our music come from our West African forebears, where there's a pulsating beat, not by drums, but sometimes it can be replicated with hand clapping and foot stomping, as was sung during religious practices. The rhythms also were heard in our call and response songs for the working in the fields and on the waterways. With the call and response, a leader calls out the words, and then everyone else answers back, falling into rhythm. And whatever job that you were doing, everyone could work together. If they were hoeing in the fields, they would sing. If they were dropping seeds in the ground, the rhythm would make everyone work together. A song like, "Oh, day, yonder come day. Oh, day, yonder come day. Oh, day, yonder come day. Day done broke in my soul. Yonder come day." Now, the sometimes as part of religious practices, the songs with the adaptation to Christianity, many of the songs had references to waterways. There is a very familiar one that would be sung during the period of slavery, when those who wished to be free would try to escape. They would flee through the marshes and the waterways, and of course, a bloodhound would be set on their tracks. And those who were left behind would let the freedom seekers know what they needed to do so that the bloodhounds would not be able to track their scent. And they would begin singing, "Wade in the water, wade in the water, children, wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water. See that man all dressed in white. God's gonna trouble the water. It'll look like the leader of the Israelites. God's gonna trouble the water. You better wade in the water. Wade in the water, children, wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water. Now, on St. Helena Island, it's part of our spiritual practices. If anyone wanted to join the church during my childhood, he or she would have to go through a process of seeking religion in the wilderness, going out to the woods. They would be dressed all in white, and usually one by one they would be sent out. They would have a white cloth around their heads, and they would have to have a dream or see a vision that would be interpreted by their spiritual leader as evidence that they had come through or had found religion. If it was determined that this was not a good dream, more or less, they would be sent back out into the woods late at night by themselves. And anything white, a white horse, a white cat, a white person, was seen, a dream of such was seen as evidence that they had come through. And then they would go through a creek shore baptism. Although I didn't participate in seeking religion practice, I was baptized as part of a creek shore baptism. And once again, the deacons as well as the baptismal candidates will be dressed in white as the processional from the church down to the waterway. Songs would be sung. Take me to the water. Take me to the water. Take me to the water to be baptized. Do you love my Jesus? Do you love my Jesus? Do you love my Jesus? Yes, I do. None but the righteous. None but the righteous. None but the righteous shall see God. Take me to the water. Take me to the water. Take me to the water to be baptized. Of course, there is a very old, familiar hymn. It's not a spiritual, but in fact, it was written because of the moans that the songwriter heard at the bottom of the slave ships. Because the Africans, primarily from West Africa, were down in the bowels of the ships, and their feet, their wrists, their throats had chains around them. They were lying prone on the wooden floors, side by side, and the songwriter heard moans. Mm, 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 Now, in the prayers houses, or praise houses that they were called in some of the Sea Island communities, I believe that in Georgetown there weren't many praise houses, but in these praise houses, or sometimes in the churches of Baptist or AME denominations, there would be a type of song that would be sung. It's called these metered songs. There'd be common meter, long meter, and short meter. And someone, a leader of the church, would line the hymns, more or less. The leader would stand to the front to begin a devotional service. They would call out the words of the hymn, and this would be an individual who could read, and most of the other church members may not be able to read, or they would not be able to read music, so that they would sing to a particular meter that was called out. And if the hymn Amazing Grace was called, was lined, the leader might say, "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see." Common meter, step back and sing. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me, that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see. Was blind, but now I see. And with all those voices joining in, some singing harmonies, some wailing, the rhythms were just like if you were out on a boat, a rowboat, out on the waterways, on a ship, out sailing far away from the land. Call and response songs, sometimes stevedores, those at the would be at the boat docks, and they would sing these songs. A very familiar one, I first heard it by the Georgia Sea Island singers. "Pay Me My Money Down." I've heard that it was a song that would be sung by stevedores down, sail to the Barbados and other islands, and it would be sung, but it was the rhythm of it and the harmonies of it as sung by the Georgia Sea Islands singers are just etched in my memory. Pay me, you owe me. Pay me my money down. Pay me or go to jail. Pay me my money down. Oh, pay me, you owe me. Pay me my money down. Pay me or go to jail. Pay me my money down. One of the earliest recordings of the lyrics of spirituals was in the Atlantic Monthly magazine around about 1856, I believe. Songs heard on St. Helena Island, South Carolina, one of them or several of them related to water. There's a familiar one. Charlotte Fortin, who was the first African American instructor at Penn School, one of the first schools in the South for freed enslaved Africans, heard this song sung by boatmen. Michael rowed a boat ashore, hallelujah. Michael rowed a boat ashore, hallelujah. Milk and honey on the other side, hallelujah. Milk and honey on the other side, hallelujah. Michael rowed the boat ashore, hallelujah. Michael rowed the boat ashore, hallelujah. There were sea shanties sung by those who worked the waterways. Would assist them with the rowing of the oars. Now, songs were sung based with tempos based on the type of conditions of the water. High tide, when it's kind of rough, they may have to row a different way than when it was easy. Michelle Moore wrote a novel, The Cigar Factory, a few years ago, and she wanted to do a theatrical presentation of this novel. I was involved. One of the songs that the Mosquito Fleet, which was a very historic group of Charleston African American or Gullah Geechee seamen, and she wanted, one of the songs was Holloway Rosie. Now, I didn't know anything about any of the sea shanties, and so I thought about how these Gullah Geechee people might sing this shanty. A few years afterwards, I learned that this was a Scottish shanty song. So the melody that I heard was somewhat reminiscent, but quite a little different. But the way that I envisioned that it might have been sung. Rosie, I'm a handsome gal. Holloway, Rosie, Holloway gal. Rosie, I'm a handsome gal. Holloway, Rosie, Holloway gal. Fancy slippers and fancy shawl. Holloway, Rosie, Holloway. Rosie gone to the fancy ball. Holloway, Rosie, Holloway gal. Now there were other songs. One I recall from my childhood, related again to the waterways. We'll stand the storm, it won't be long. We'll anchor by and by. We'll stand the storm, it won't be long. We'll anchor by and by. A ship is on the ocean we'll anchor by and by. A ship is on the ocean, we'll anchor by and by. Oh yes, we'll stand the storm, it won't be long. We'll anchor by and by. We'll stand the storm, it won't be long. We'll anchor by and by. It's headed for the harbor. We'll anchor by and by. It's headed for the harbor. We'll anchor by and by. Oh yes, we'll stand the storm, it won't be long. We'll anchor by and by. We'll stand the storm, it won't be long. We'll anchor by and by. And that song to me is reflective of the significance, the importance of being Gullah Geechee. Gullah Geechee involves our history. It involves our connections with our West African ancestors, as well as the communities of other island communities throughout the world where Africans were enslaved during the transatlantic slave trade. Jamaica, the West Indies, Trinidad, Cuba, even Brazil. It also involves our speechways, the rhythm of the way that we speak, the intonations, the lilting of our voices, as well as foodways. All of the foods from the oceans, from the rivers, the shrimp, we call them swimps, the fish, we say fush, crabs, aishas, or oysters, as well as the foods grown in gardens that need water in order to for them to grow, for the in the woods, those plants that are used for herbal remedies, which again need water in order to grow. And water is needed in order to steep them, or to make salves and poultices, remedies that some people would regard as root medicine, but really were herbal remedies made by those who had the knowledge of how to use the plants, how to use the water for medicinal purposes, as well as the songs, some that I've demonstrated. And in our songs have been a release from the pressures of enslavement, has been the inspiration to endure, to have faith, to stand the storm with an awareness that we would anchor by and by, and with an understanding and an appreciation of our cultural heritage, our spirituality, our cultural practices, our art, our ways of knowledge of harnessing the land and also the waterways, we indeed will stand the storm and we will anchor by and by.
Hello, I am Vanessa Green, and I'm in the sanctuary of Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Georgetown, South Carolina. Bethel has the distinction of being the first church to be independently started, established free of any plantation ties. And our first pastor was the Reverend Augustus Z. Carr, who not only organized Bethel AME Church, but was a political organizer in a very general sense, in a time when it was very dangerous to do such work. So the first structure, the first Bethel AME, was built in 1882, about 100 feet from where I'm sitting now. The lumber was actually brought on logging barges to the docks in Georgetown and then towed in wagons up Broad Street to this site. The freed men, the emancipated men who were tasked with this challenge, were probably ship workers, stevedores, and skilled carpenters. The original wood structure of Bethel was replaced by the brick facade that we see today in approximately 1908 under the guidance of the pastor, who at the time was Reverend Mance. When I think about the first enslaved Africans arriving 2 blocks from where I live, it just does something to me. It sends shivers through me. And even though I did not grow up in Georgetown, South Carolina, my father was in the military. I feel that connection to Black people throughout the Atlantic who were transported from Africa to all parts of the world. When I travel in places of the Black Atlantic, like in the Caribbean, I was recently in Belize. When I go to Jamaica, down in Cuba, I feel this incredible connection. And I see people who remind me of my Georgetown, South Carolina family. When I'm in Jamaica, through the music and through the food and through the dance, I see my people from Georgetown. When I am in places like Panama or Cuba, I see evidence, I see the resonance of my people here in South Carolina in those places. And I always, always, always feel at home.
There are several components to Gullah culture. One of them is the culture and its connection to the water. The other, as mentioned earlier, would be the culture's connection to the Creator, which is their linkage of spirituality. And there was a time in South Carolina when congregation of African Americans were denied and prohibited. And so it was in the connection to the water, in finding their Creator, that the invisible church was established, where they would gather themselves by the riverside and speak into arbor bushes as to keep the voice mulled some. There is a long and deep connection between the Gullah culture and the water, particularly as my historical imagination would allow me to imagine here in Georgetown, my home, where there are 5 rivers, again, that run through this county. And I think of my ancestors and the ancestors of my friends and wonder how they made it over, it had to have been the connection with the Creator that allowed them to be able to endure what they did, built what they did, and ultimately died the way that they did. It's just something that is beyond me. But again, it is something that I am a part of. And so it carries me, it sustains me. And I still find, as my ancestors did, the connection between the water and the Creator as a part of my culture.
What does Gullah mean to me? I was brought up to believe that Gullah is a lot of everything. You have to realize that the Gullah language is a language of all these different tribes from Africa getting the language together and merging it with American language. You have to think about when these slaves came over, they didn't understand English, and then they didn't understand each other. So they had to combine their language and the English language to come up with something that they could use that was easier for them. So you got the words like come here or been there and all those things like that. And how does Gullah reflect with the river? Because it's a spiritual thing. When we sing, we bring everything together. And they used to have services at night down by the river because it was in secret, because they wanted to worship their God, our God, the way they wanted to. So Gullah means to me a smart kind of people. Because just think about it. How many languages do we know? They had to learn different languages, had to just understand and fear that if they didn't understand, what would happen? So sometimes when they go to the river and at night and they have their worship service and they had no kind of music, they just had the rhythm of the drums, you would hear somebody come up, one of the older women, and they'll start off with something as simple as, ooh. Then you hear the next person, ooh. Then you would hear somebody sing, wade in the waters, wade in the waters, chillin', wade in the water. God's gonna trouble them waters. Say it again, wade in the waters, wade in the waters, children, wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water. Oh, who's that walking in that white? Looks like the leader of the Israelite. We're gonna wade in the waters, wade in the waters, children, wade in the water. God gonna trouble them waters. Songs and what they mean and how you sing them determines how you feel sometimes. And I have this song, We Are Climbing Jacob's Ladder. And as I start, it starts of, we are climbing Jacob's ladder. We are climbing Jacob's ladder. See, when you use that kind of cadence, it's almost like soulful, and you praising God and you asking him for whatever it is you need. And then as you sing that song, it fills you and you start singing, we are climbing Jacob's ladder we are climbing. Jacob's ladder we are climbing. Jacob's ladder, shoulders of the Lord. See, using the different cadence made you feel a different way. So any song you usually hear us singing in churches, African Americans, may start off as a simple and by the time you finish, they are up on their feet. So next time you hear a song as simple as Jesus loves me, you can take it from here to there. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me.
My name is Dedrick Bonds. I am a native of Georgetown, born and raised. Born and raised here, a product of the Georgetown County Schools. Graduated from Georgetown High School in 1994. Went on to Morehouse College and graduated there with a degree in African American Studies. Matriculated at Clark Atlanta University in pursuit of the Master's in History there. And most recently, within the past year or so, took an MBA from Coastal Carolina University. I am a public school teacher and a nonprofit director. What is Gullah? Gola, as the original patois would have it pronounced, right? Gullah, as we now say. It is, what it represents to me first is survival. Survival. There were many challenges for West Africans that came through the triangular trade route, right? That made it to the Caribbean, then eventually to the shores of Charleston, that brought my people to Georgetown. They are survivors. The Gullah culture is one of a melting pot, if you will, of other cultures. And they're meshing together to create one culture that has sustained most of the African Americans that survived the treacherous route here to America. That's what Gullah is to me. The nature of water is important to the Gullah culture because it provides isolation, it provides sustenance. It ultimately gave Gullah people their own survival, their own means of survival, right? Again, Gullah is the meshing of several cultures. First, it would be the many cultures that came together on the western shores of Africa that populated the slave ships that came here. It would be the meshing of those African cultures with the Caribbean cultures, primarily the French and the Barbados, right? And then it would be the survival of both of those transmittal of cultures over to America to mesh with and create what then ultimately becomes the Gullah culture. It is, again, for me, it is about survival of a people. And it tells our story from one generation to the next. It's almost unfortunate that we are dying almost. The culture is dying. It is being appropriated. I can't necessarily say misappropriated, but it is being appropriated. I think it starts with the long-serving tenure of Congressman James Clyburn and his long fight for the establishment of a federal Gullah-Geechee corridor, right? It starts, I believe, in Florida, comes all the way up through Georgia, South Carolina, which most of our coastline is, and certain parts of the coastline in North Carolina. So that brought about a resurgence of the awareness of what Gullah culture is. Very interestingly enough, having been born and raised here and being of age, I can remember when it was almost shameful to be a representation of Gullah culture, because it was primarily through our way of speaking, our patois, right, that we were recognized. And so it was at one point almost a badge of shame. It is good now to see a positive resurgence in that respect, where it's not a badge of shame, but instead a badge of honor. But at what rate will we continue to exploit it for it to be recognized and not just survive, right? Gullah, many things to many people, the water, an important part of it. One thing I can say about this water experience is, while many of us enjoy it for what it just naturally is, right? The ability to have a self-sustaining life, to marvel at God's creation, I would also like to think that it could also be a point of post-traumatic stress disorder for a lot of people of Gullah culture. We don't have a mastery of the water. We don't command the water, right? We don't have the affordability to get the toys of the water. And so there's still this veil that separates us and the water, while we can still admire it for all of its natural beauty. Gullah culture, many things to many people. Culture, to me, as I've learned it, is learned behavior. So while we're all family, we have learned our behaviors separately because of family associations or regional associations or territorial or political, whatever those motivating factors may be. Nevertheless, we're still family, right? So we still can identify the red rice when we sit down at the table. We've cooked it differently, but we know the end result is supposed to be the same. Gullah, Geechee, you know, again, it's their story to tell. It's their story to tell, because each of us have that unique connection to the culture. Gullah, it's your story to tell. What is your connection to it, right? It's not to say that it is not deep, it is just not the same as mine. Joseph Hayne Rainey, the first African American elected to the United States House of Representatives, was born here and died here in Georgetown, South Carolina. Mr. Rainey was born in 1832 and served in the United States House of Representatives from 1870 to 1879. Mr. Rainey also had a very interesting history with water. He was conscripted during the Civil War as a blockade runner. And when he saw an opportunity to leave from Charleston, where he was living and working at the time, he and his wife Susan Rainey did so and escaped, if you will, to Bermuda. There, while in Bermuda, he was highly regarded and respected as a barber, as he was in Charleston before leaving. Mr. Rainey made a decent life for himself. And interestingly enough, when leaving Bermuda to come back to South Carolina, they took out an article in a local paper in Bermuda that thanked the natives of the island for their hospitality and their helping to make the Raineys a success. And then they came on back, first to Charleston, where he got involved in Republican politics, and then back in Georgetown, where he was eventually elected to the United States House of Representatives. The life of Mr. Joseph Hayne Rainey, perhaps one of our first most popular Gullah Georgetonians. So this house is the family home, not the birth home, I don't believe, but the family home of the Raineys. When Mr. Edward Rainey, Joseph's dad, got his freedom, I believe he was able to purchase this house as well. This is the house that Joseph returned to South Carolina broken for all intents and purposes, in spirit and almost financially, after having served in the United States House of Representatives, to take care of his father, who died shortly before Joseph did. I think there was about 3 years that separated the deaths of the father and the son, and both died here in this house. Now, Rainey did own property in Connecticut additionally, but this is where he resided when he died. We began to see the creation and the takeoff of what would become public education. And who is leading that fight for public education are the newly released slaves, or the newly released enslaved. They knew that for the longest of times, education was denied, and it wasn't just denied them, no, you can't have it. It was written in law that it was prohibited for them to learn. So once the end of chattel slavery had come, one of the first things that they did, besides satisfying the desire to officially become married in the recognition of family, was the pursuit of education. And Mr. Rainey, during his 9 years in the House of Representatives, was a strong proponent of the newly freed men gaining equity in education.
Let's talk about Gullah. You've heard of the word Gullah, and it is trending if you live here in the Low Country, meaning anywhere in South Carolina, Georgia, North Carolina, or Florida. But what is Gullah? To many people, Gullah is broken English. To others, Gullah is food. And to many other, Gullah is sweet basket or colorful garment. Well, I'm here to tell you that it is all of that. All of that in a bag of chips. Gullah is a culture that was derived from people who were brought over from Africa to the Americas, but also in Gullah, just a tinge of Caribbean, or what we call Creole, all right? And so Gullah, like culture, is a way of life. However, Gullah is a dying species. And that is one of the reasons it is trending. Most universities in the South, almost every university, are now offering programs on Gullah culture. Why? You cannot separate Gullah from our history in the United States any more than you can separate water from the ocean. They just go together. Gullah may have started briefly in the 1700s, but it really picked up in the 1800s as more and more indigenous people from Africa were brought over here. And I don't have to tell you why, but if you do not know, it's basically to work the land, mostly rice, but also cotton and a little bit of indigo. So Gullah is a way of life. What we're going to be talking about today is that there is a difference, and sometimes a profound difference, between Gullah on the inland or the mainland and Gullah on the sea island. Gullah on the sea island has many components to it that you will not necessarily find on the mainlands. Now, what is not common knowledge is that most of the African people who were enslaved were brought through the ports, three main ports, Charleston, New Orleans, and the southern parts of Alabama. However, there was plenty of slave ships that came through the sea islands. Now, when we talk about Gullah, we have to understand that Gullah will come in two components. Gullah that basically was from the 1700s right up to the mid-20th century, 1940 or 1950, particularly here in the Low Country. And then it began to gradually change. And so I'm going to give you a couple of islands that you may have heard of, particularly if you live down here. You may have heard of John's Island. You may have heard of James Island. You may have heard of Pawleys Island. You may have heard of Mount Pleasant. You may have heard of St. Helena, and I'm sure you've heard of Hilton Head Island. That's only one of maybe 15 sea islands in the state of South Carolina. Not that there's not any in North Carolina. There are, and certainly in Georgia. One of the most famous sea islands that's been covered in history is Defusky Island. That's right off of Beaufort. And of course, there are several other islands. We call Sandy Island here part of Gullah, and it is Gullah, but it's technically not a sea island, okay, because it is fresh water and not salt water. Well, the sea island culture is unique for one reason and one reason only. They were able, because they were isolated from the rest of the mainland of America, they were able to keep the African heritage and culture together longer, pristinely longer than any other. So the continuity was there. So if you were to go there today, certainly Mount Pleasant, you're not going to see a great deal of the Gullah culture. You're not going to hear it, you're not going to see it, except if you are on the highways going towards Charleston or coming from Charleston, you will see the sweet baskets situation set up. However, if you go to Watermala Island, even today, you will notice that a lot of that culture is straight out of 150, 200 years ago. And that's not by accident. Because of quote-unquote gentrification, a lot of those sea islands have changed. So when I'm talking about sea islands, I'm going to be talking about before 1950 and after 1950. And one of the things that you will notice is that almost all of the islands in South Carolina are now connected with a bridge or some sort of connection from landmass, with the exception of Sandy Island. You still have to take a boat. First things you need to know about Sea Island is that they have psychologically, emotionally, a different mindset, a different consciousness than what African Americans of African ascent have today. Now, what am I talking about? Because of institutionalized slavery, because they were taught and told that they were basically almost non-existent, almost animals. In fact, you've heard of the 3/5 of a man. And because of that teaching and because of institutionalized slavery for well over 200 years, there's a different mindset because they were convinced, they were programmed to believe, conditioned to believe that they could not do certain things but labor, all right? And of course, there was no such thing as formal education for 99% of the enslaved people. However, On the Sea Islands, it was different. How so, Steve? It was different because the so-called overseers or the masters of the Sea Islands were not there, let's say 75, 90% of the time. Why were they not there? They were not there because they could succumb at a great rate to malaria and yellow fever, particularly yellow fever. If the enslaved people on the Sea Islands wanted anything, they had to make it themselves. And that include the cultivation of rice even before and after so-called emancipation, but not just rice. They had to fish. They had to build their own homes. Some called it shanties. Some were made of bricks. Okay, they had to do their own clothes. And in other words, if something had to be done, they were not going to Walmart or Target. They had to do it themselves. Enslaved people literally learned how to do a lot of things that the people on the mainland did not, including my ancestors who are from Georgetown. Okay? I marveled at that because I wasn't actually raised in Georgetown. But when I found out, when I moved back south, that how many people can do their own plumbing or fixing and whatever, I was amazed. I was like, how did you learn that? They didn't learn it in school. Well, neither did the people on the Sea Island. They learned it from their ancestors, and their ancestors got it from Africa. There's a very celebrated craftsman named Philip Simmons who built several of the ironworks or blacksmith work in Charleston. Now, he learned it from his uncle, and he learned it from his father. So it was passed down. What did that do? That gave the people of the Sea Islands a sense of pride and a sense of accomplishment and not a sense of inferiority. Sea Islanders don't have that sense, even to this day. They're very proud. I tell you another thing. If they don't know you, you are considered an outsider, whether you're black, white, or any other hue in between. Because the way they identify you is who are your people, who are your kinfolks. And if you say, look, I was living in Connecticut all of these years, but my grandfather used to live here, and they say, yeah, who was he? Well, who is he? So if you can identify that, there was a time where they would not give you access to their property. And you know, their property was communal property, where they always probably built their homes in the same place. That still happens even today in Browns Ferry and some other places around Georgetown. And now legally you can, if there's a deed, you can prove it. But you have to understand that there wasn't always a deed. So what am I saying? I'm saying that Sea Islanders have a culture that goes way back before emancipation. And they were able to do things like basket weaving, like clothes weaving, like fishing in certain ways. And we're going to talk a little bit about that when we talk about the economy. All right, what else is part of their social structure? Well, they believe that the most important or the primary ingredient to living or moving into the house is if someone else, human, had lived in the house. If you tell them that this house has never been lived in by any other person, that they don't want that. And it's just the opposite with most people. If you tell most persons that, well, house used to belong to Mr. McIntyre, but he died. I don't want to live in there because the person's there. But it's just the opposite with the Sea Islanders because they believe that the closest they get to their ancestors is through what they call the living dead. And we're going to get into that when we talk about religion because there's a lot of norms, a lot of traditions in the cemeteries and graveyards about planting near or being buried near a tree or being buried near the water, okay? Or putting items, plates, forks, various things to identify, okay? So we're going to talk about that. But their primary reason for moving into a house is that if it's been inhabited by someone else. Also, they have something called a communal yard. In other words, they will not allow the yard to grow grass for their children to play. Now, why is that? Because that is an area in the yard where their children play. It also cuts down on mosquitoes and snakes and other creepy crawly things. But also, that is where they educated. And so we're going to talk about education when we get to that part too. Because African Gullah education was not formal, because we were not allowed to go to formal schools, at least up until the 1940s. That does not mean that they didn't educate them. How did they educate their children? By metaphors, by stories, by folk tales. You've heard of Brer Rabbit, okay? And it also had a moral to it. It wasn't just to entertain them, but it had a moral to it. So when the African people who were on these islands educated their children, they gathered them in a communal area, because the houses were set up like a village, very much the way they did in Africa. Instead of it being huts, it was now called shanties. And then later on, it was made out of wood and brick and mason, mortar. So they would always develop it where they would be in a unit, because most of them were related. Why were they related? Because in the Sea Island tradition, Gullah tradition, they believed in family, not just the immediate circle of the family, but extended family. So if they knew that you were related, even from a distance, they would welcome you in. If you were an unwed mother, you would be welcome in. If you were divorced, you would be welcome in. They didn't believe in divorce, but they would still welcome you because they know that you're family. This goes back to Africa. And the way they would develop it, they would watch your children if you had the work. They taught ultimate respect for elders. And almost every generation and every ethnicity and almost every race have done that. Why would the Africans not do that? I don't know, but they had respect for family. Now, on the inlands, it was a little bit different. Why? Because the sanctity of a family didn't exist. The reason it did not exist is because their so-called slave masters didn't want it to exist. At any given time, some member of your family could be sold to Georgia, could be sold to Florida, could be sold to another plantation, literally overnight. Especially if they couldn't pay for their debt, they would just sell them off, because they were considered property. And so there was no such thing as a sanctity of the family. The Africans tried, but they didn't. And matter of fact, when they even had children, the masters were happy because it was cha-ching, more money. Now, they did get married, don't get me wrong, but it was not in a church. It was usually in front of the church. And it was not sanctioned legally, all right? So when you talk about family, there's mainland family, and then there's on the Sea Island. In the Sea Islands, it was just the opposite. They were very close-knit in their family, both immediate family and extended family. So they did everything together. Keep in mind that there are really two divisions here. Again, one is prior to, let's say, 1950, and after 1950. Now, when you talk about sea islands, particularly the coast of South Carolina, there are about 13 to 15 main ones. Now, in total, there are literally hundreds of sea islands from North Carolina all the way down to the tip of Florida, okay? However, the ones that are inhabited are the ones that probably had plantations on it some kind of way. But in terms of economics, it was originally there to be used for crops. The three main crops were rice, overwhelmingly, something called sea island cotton, which was also very profitable, and then indigo, okay? But for the most part, it was rice. On these sea islands, again, because the masters were not there, and the masters basically wanted to know that the laborers were doing their job, growing the crop, and then when the crop was ready to be harvested, they could sell it and get their profit or their money. And don't fool yourself, they got their money. The plantation owners or the rich planters were the most wealthy or the richest people in America at that time. This was long before James Andrew Carnegie, J.P. Morgan, John D. Rockefeller. These are northern industrialists. But the planters who lived on the east coast of South Carolina, Justin Ward and Milton and so many others, Austin, these people were millionaires long before any of the others. Now, that began to change after the war, but between 1850 and 1860, they were the richest people probably in the world, but certainly in the United States. When the masters were not on the Sea Islands, which is, again, 75 to 90% of the time, the Sea Islanders, once they did their job, rice can only be grown and cultivated during X amount of months. So what did they do on the other months? Well, they were able to grow their own crops: okra, tomatoes, watermelons, corn, squash. We can go on and on and on. They were able to build their own houses. They were able to sew their own clothes. And so they were doing this before they were emancipated. And as I said earlier, they were in a better position at the emancipation because they already had these skills. They had certain freedoms, certain liberties that the people on the mainland did not have, including my own ancestors. So we didn't know those skills. Now, many of them did. Don't get me wrong. All over Georgetown, there's a lot of buildings and houses that were literally made by craftsmen with those skills. And again, they didn't go to school to learn these skills. In terms of economics, once they were freed, the average black decided they would stay on the islands. Why? Because that's all they knew. But they were in better position on the Sea Islands because they had skills. So again, all of those crops, those foods that I just mentioned, they knew about that. But also, let's take one of the islands that is dear to my heart, Sandy Island. On Sandy Island, they actually grew rice for a profit. Same thing they have been doing for centuries. Only this time the money was going into their own house or for their own church. And they were a self-sustained community right up until today, okay? Now, around 1900, not just the Sea Islands, but many of the plantations, because they had lost the war, many of the plantations were bought up by what they call northern capitalists, if you will, and they used it for recreation. They used it for sporting. You've heard of Hobcall Barony. That was purchased by Bernard Baruch, whose roots were in South Carolina, but he was actually raised in another state. He bought 18,000 acres. Wasn't Sea Island, but still, it used to be a rice plantation. You've heard of the Huntingtons, and I forget the husband's name, Huntington. Okay, they have what is now 5 plantations that is now called Brook Green's Garden. I'm sorry, more than 5. But these were very profitable plantations. And I can go on and on. Tom Yorkie, former owner of the Red Sox. Okay, he owns Cat Island, which is a sea island, and South Island, which is a sea island. And so he originally bought it for recreation. Then, and this was the early 1900s, then in the mid-century, they came for developers. Developers realized that we could put a hotel here. Talk about Myrtle Beach. We could put a resort here. We could put a golf field here. So this is how they came. But then some folks said, well, I wouldn't mind living here. The weather's nice. The tax base is nice. It was still going to Florida, but South Carolina had a nice tax base. They began to develop Hilton Head Island. That was one of the first. And after, they're like sharks in the water. Once they smell blood, developers were coming from everywhere. Why? Because they could make money. Well, there's nothing wrong with development, but it has to be done with empathy for the indigenous people who have already been there, all right? So what happened was, as they began to develop these places and more people moved in, that means more and more people moved out because they lost their property, either legally or illegally. But once the bridges were built, then they can go off the island and get a job. Where did they work? They worked in schools, they worked in hotels, they worked in other buildings, they worked on the roads, wherever they can work. And they probably didn't get the same wages, They spoke Gullah. No one really cared what they spoke because they knew how to do the job, even if it was something as simple as operating an elevator. Now, one of the main ways to make a living on the Sea Islands, as you probably guessed it, was the use of the waterways. That's God giving us his beautiful green earth. There's water and there's land. And the Africans certainly knew about water, particularly those from West Africa. So, how did they use the water? They went fishing for not just fish, but a very profitable industry: oyster, clam, shrimp, what they call mussels or mussels. This, of course, fish from the sea. And don't fool yourself, it was very, very profitable. As a matter of fact, if you go back to the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, you find some of the biggest fishing companies on the East Coast, right here in the Low Country. Well, because the people who were from these islands literally worked there, especially the women, okay, especially the mothers. That's what they did. Now, I mentioned that when Africans fished, they had their own way of fishing, of attracting fish, but because it was outlawed for them to have guns, they had to, if they wanted to, kill alligators with their bare hands. Don't ask me how, but I know they did it, okay? And they weren't the only. Indigenous people did it as well, okay? So they found ingenious ways to do things to stay afloat. And because of the waterways, they also were able to travel to other places. They didn't do a lot, but they did a little bit. So if you knew something about navigating a small boat or a canoe, you could literally visit some of the islands because they were so close to each other.
I'm Dr. Jody Barnes. I'm a Heritage Trust archaeologist with the South Carolina Department of Natural Resources, and I am working at the Tom Yawkey Wildlife Center Heritage Preserve, a property owned by the Department of Natural Resources. It's a Gullah Geechee fishing village. In 2017, during Hurricane Irma, storm surge caused severe beach erosion, and human remains were eroded from the shore of South Island on the Tom Yawkey Wildlife Center. A fisherman noticed the remains and contacted DNR, and the DNR contacted the Richland County coroner. Dr. Bill Stevens is a historical archaeologist and the assistant coroner in Richland County. And they came and excavated the human remains and found a series of buttons and ceramics and other artifacts. The human remains were found face down in the beach. And so Dr. Stevens did a study of those human remains and found that he was a young 18 to 20-year-old African-American male. There was no sign of, there was no cause of death that he could identify, but based on the way the remains were found on the beach, it looked like he washed up on the shore as a result of drowning. He was found where it appears on the 1907 map of Cat North and South Island as a fisherman's village. And so this started a whole study of, an archaeological study of this site so that we can identify the human remains, hope to find descendants, find out maybe if we can find some people who are related to him and give him a proper burial, but also learn more about this important site that is, that we don't talk about, the history of fishing and this African-American fishing village at the turn of the 20th century. We sent the clothing and materials found with him to Clemson University, and they were able to identify the material as natural rubber, silk, Prosser 4-hole buttons, which date to the 1880s, 1890s, as well as a gilt and Prosser button and a couple of gilt buttons that they were unable to date. And they thought that the materials and the buttons look like fishermen at the turn of the 20th century, like in these photos that you see here. One of the things we're looking at is the history of hurricanes in the area. We're thinking about the ways that living on the sea islands and being a fisherman, what kinds of, how that might have been a stress for their lives. And with the human remains, we're thinking about how frequent was it for people to drown. Michael Thompson did a study in Charleston, and he found that drowning was one of the most common cause of death during the late 19th century. So we started doing archaeology to learn more about the fishing village and the people who lived and worked there. We used the 1928 plat of the fishing village and overlaid it on an aerial photograph that you can see here. And so we dug what we would call shovel test pits, small excavation units, every 15 meters in the village to try to target households. You can see that the village is eroding from the shore. There are bricks and glass bottles and ceramics all over the shore. DNR applied for 2 grants to address the effects of climate change on archaeological sites. And this is one of the sites that we're concerned about, as being a Gullah Geechee fishing village. And we can see from looking at aerial photographs and maps how quickly the site is eroding. In 1949, the aerial photographs show this as being a roadbed, and then another addition on the other side of the road there would have been houses, and on the shore we see an early. This is one of the best signs of erosion. When you have a U.S. Corps of Engineers geological marker eroding from the shore, that's a pretty good sign that erosion is happening. Most of the artifacts we're finding really reflect the day-to-day, everyday lives. Like we have dishes and ceramics, but we do have these lead fishing weights, the cast net weights that we found. We see lots of glass and ceramics, the everyday things that people use for eating, medicine, eroding from the shore, that tell us that this site is quickly being lost. Native American ceramics that we've found here, showing that people have been here since about 4,000 years ago. The bricks here, so you can see the evidence of the house. So this one has the a maker's mark on it that gives us some clues to when the house would have been built or renovated. So I think about Gullah Geechee as being about origins in West Africa, and so the ways that we see West African traditions coming to the Carolina coast, and the emergence of a particular culture, a culture specific to the Low Country and to the Carolina coast, because of the interrelations between enslaved Africans, indigenous people, and European settlers. And so the cultures that emerge on the plantation sites during plantation slavery is where the roots of Gullah Geechee culture. And then it becomes a little bit more complicated because we think about the ways that planters work to suppress African cultures during slavery. We can think about the Vesey Uprising. That you start to see the really the limits, the change of African traditions to a more plantation economy, restructuring the slave settlements so there are single rows rather than set up like an African village. So really it's kind of, and so then an emergence, a re-emergence of Gullah Geechee culture with emancipation. See a resurgence of religious and spiritual traditions, resurgence in foodways, and it's also about a resistance to the ways that people have been living during plantation slavery as people reclaimed their cultural identities. I want to set the scene for fishing. So on this property, South Island, Cat Island, there were at least 7 plantations, and so archaeologically, we've only excavated 1 plantation here at Yawkey, but archaeologically, we know that fishing was a way to substitute, to add to people's diets, to the rations that they were given, right? During excavations of plantations, that's what we see is a lot of fish bones and wild animal bones that where people are hunting and fishing to supplement their diet, right? Because on a plantation, they are given limited cuts of meat and molasses and rations that are not necessarily or meager, and so we see fishing as a way of being a important way of life. And they're skilled hunters and fishermen, right? These are people who are also doing it for the planters, that they are the hunting guides. If you read the slave narratives, the ex-slave narratives, that there's people who talk about how that, after emancipation, that they are that they're such skilled dog users and such skilled fishermen that they are a little bit of a threat to the white elite that continue to maintain the land. So as after emancipation, people, decide that they would much rather hunt and fish for a living and make a living that way than work on rice plantations. And that's, there's already a shortage of labor on those rice plantations, right? There's a challenge to finding people to continue to work the plantations. And part of that is that people can make a living and hunt and fish and survive that way without having to do all the heavy labor of rice fields. As the plantations, as rice dies and it moves out westward to Arkansas, you see all these northern folks move down to the Carolinas and buy these plantations, and you see a resurgence of hunting and fishing camps. And these places need African American faces and bodies and labor to continue that tradition, right? The idea of the hunt camp becomes needs the ideas of the plantation in order to continue. You see these two things, a resurgence of the plantations and the rebuilding them in this Victorian model that differs from the ways that they looked during the antebellum period. Hunting and fishing, right? And the need for African American labor, and at the same time a desire to be an independent worker and not and necessarily work for people. And so these dual things happening at the turn of the 20th century. This site where we are, there's the whole gaps of we know that around 1811 that they start to cut this up into narrow 100-foot lots. Who owns it? I don't know at that stage. We're just looking at deed research. This is what we have to come back to. But by the turn of the 20th century, 1880s, 1890s, you start to see some black landowners on this part of this land. So who all, we've got all the deeds that Tom Yonke cleared titles, so we have all the deeds and we're working on transcribing them so we can kind of figure out all those land transactions. So we see on this land in the we have a plat from the 1928 where we have J.E. McQuaid, who was a northerner from he was a New Yorker, and he moved to South Carolina. The turn of the 20th century, on the 1900 census, he is listed as a fish dealer. Some point he acquires land here on the in this village, and he later opens a cannery, and so he's part of this growing seafood industry, right? I mean, like at that turn of the 20th century, you start to see, thinking material culture, canning of seafood. Excavated a plantation in Arkansas, and you would be surprised at all the early 19th, late 19th century seafood cans that people were, because so there was that increased industry which Georgetown and this was happening at this time. So there were a number of African American landowners. Robert Ellison was a schooner captain in 1900. E.F. Ford was a fisherman in 1900 and later became a fishing dealer, 1910. Thomas Alston was a cook during the Civil War and later is a tugboat captain. Jonas Brown was listed in the census as a fisherman and his wife is a midwife. So these are the African American people who lived and worked on in this fishing village. And the census data really helps us, imagine people who would have occupied the village. I mean, archaeologically, we see lots of, we find the glass bottles, the pottery, and so to be able to put a name and a face and kind of envision people's lives here, that's where combining the primary sources and the archaeological evidence together.
Hi, my name is John Henry Smalls from Georgetown, South Carolina, and very proud of it. My family originated in the United States from the Walkermore Neck of Georgetown County. Over the years, my family have lived on the plantations of hobcob, 5 different plantations over there, and Acadia, mostly out of hobcob and Acadia. Also some out of the Anderson plantation. Over the years, we visited those plantations, and just a few days ago, my family had a family reunion and they went over to hobcob. And they toured all the slave cabins and churches, not churches, but church that was built by our cousins. Over the years, I have been very close with my people in Acadia plantation, but not knowing much. I've never been on hobcob, but I noticed there. In that area, most of my folks that died during the times that we were able to identify, they are buried on a hill as soon as you cross the bridge, leaving Georgetown, going toward Paulus Island. In Acadia, I used to, on the weekends, my cousins and Pauline Great used to pick us up in a pickup truck and take us to Acadia, and we'd stay over there all day and play. And over the years, people ask, well, why you always want to do things for everybody and not take care of yourself? But I can't forget where I came from. I never forget that Pauline shouldn't have to do it, but she would take us over there and she spent time with us. When our mothers had to work, fathers had to work, and she wasn't working. She worked in the plantation system, but she would take time, and right now, that's one reason I try to give back to the community as much as I can, because of the things people have done for me over the years. Coming back to Georgetown, for some reason I seem to want to go to the boulevard, which is down on the end of Front Street, and I sit in my car there, and some people come by and they'll stop and they started speaking. And one day I was speaking to a guy, and he said, well, I used to live right on the corner. Oh, that's on the corner of Prince and East Bay. And he said, we used to play, there was some guys used to live across the street, and we used to play with them, and we used to play on the White Sand. The White Sand is a little area right across East Bay Street, and the sand was beach sand, and when you walk, you dig a hole before you get a foot deep, it would fill in because the water, the tide, water level will fill it back in. And I'm trying to remember him, and I couldn't remember him, and he kept talking, and kind of found out that we actually grew up together but didn't know him. And plus that was during segregation. But he was not, and he was white, and I was black, but we still enjoyed each other, but I didn't remember it. Growing up in the community that I lived in and grew up in, it was called Slab Town. The reason it was called Slab Town because after slavery, I can't remember the guy's name, but he built a sawmill down in that area, east of Meeting Street, back to the water. It was, and also down that way on east of Meeting Street, in the front street, there used to be a boat landing. The ferry used to come in down that way, and the people that, after slavery, they came across the river into Georgetown proper. And when they did that, they used the wood from the trimmings of the trees that they made timber out, and used those wood, and they made, that was called a slab. So they used those to build their houses. And that's the area that I lived in. I've never lived in my, growing up, never lived more than three blocks from the rivers, from 3 of the 5 rivers. And the rivers were good because everybody in our village, they were fishermen. Everybody that lived there, and when they would go out to sea to fish, they had different seasons. They had shrimp season, shad season, sturgeon season, then they had oysters and clam. And when they would do that, they would go out, it was a hard job, and it was tiresome and bothersome to them, but that's the occupation that they had. And we were told coming out that whatever happens, you're gonna be a fisherman, because that's all that's here. A fisherman, to be a fisherman. And over the years, all I knew that I was gonna be a fisherman. That was my heritage, to be a fisherman. And when I guess around 6 or 7 years old, I would go every day that I wasn't in school, I would go down to Cthulhu's fish house and sit on the dock and watch the boats go in and out. And my father was a fisherman. His father was a fisherman. He got drowned. He got drowned, and they never found him. And then in 1957, I was at school, at Beck School over on the airport, and it was raining. I remember the day it was raining, and I was standing with 2 of my friends, and somebody came up and said that 3 men had just got drowned while fishing, shrimping, and I never even thought about it. And then when I went home that afternoon after school, there was a lot of people at the house, and that's when I found out that evening. They never told me at school. When I came home that evening, I found out that one of the men was my father. Then Dan Jenkins and Robert Dennison. And the boat that they were working for Cthulhu, and the name of the boat was the Lottie C. Lottie was his mother. The C was for Cthulhu, Lottie C. Cthulhu. That was it, Lottie Cthulhu. And they never found, like I said, they never found the boat. They never found my father. But they did find, a few days later, they found Robert Dennison. And it was hard growing up, without a father. But I knew that he died trying to support us. Our family, we never gave up. This monument, when I came back to Georgetown from working with General Motors in Willow Run, Michigan, and I came home and everything was named. All the bridges were named after folks that I knew when I was growing up. And there was nothing about the folks that my family, the family from our communities, was nowhere. And so I figured that if they were asking for names to go on this monument, so I called, and then I had to send information to the Coast Guard, and they researched it and found out that these people had actually drowned, and during that time, and that really made me feel good, because now if I feel down, I can come here and look at this I don't remember. I remember my father a little. I was in the 3rd grade when he died, and but I always thought he's gonna come back. And like I said, they never found him, and I always thought that somebody would find him somewhere and bring him back home, but it didn't happen. And so sometimes I ride through here, and all of my cousins, as many as I can, I try to get them interested in this and come and look at it. This is a beautiful monument. Come and look at this monument and see one of the few things, because there are no markers in the graveyards for them, because like I said, they were never found. And so to me, it's very important that we have some place to come and sit and look and just, think about it. My sisters and brothers, they don't really remember him, but I remember one thing about him. Before he died, I remember my mother saying he never leave his house in the morning without kissing his girls. I had my sister Deborah and my sister Diane. He never leave without kissing them goodbye. August 8, 1960, the guy that lived right across the street from me, Tom Funny, his father was one of the captain of one of the Cthulhu boats. And that morning, the boat, when they went to go to work, the boat wouldn't start. And they had to work on the engine. And like I told you, I would go down to the dock every day. And when I was down there, they were working on the engine, and his son, Tom Funny Jr., was a very good swimmer. And when they finally got the boat to start, it was a little box, a box they would sit on, bench. They call it a bench, I'm sorry. And on that bench, the bench was on the back of the boat, and when he did the pull, it jumped. The boat jumped when it started. It fell into the water. When it fell into the water, it was going from Cthulhu over to Independence. And when it got halfway in the middle of that, Tom Funny Jr. swam to the bench. As soon as he touched the bench, he started going around in circles. And people on the dock started hollering, "Catch that boy, catch that boy." And George Parker was on Independence Dock, and he dove in the water. They could swim. All them guys could swim. They were all fishermen. And he dove in, and when he got to where Tom Jr. was, he said all he could feel is when he went down for the last time, he touched him, like just rubbed against him. And that was the first person that I ever see that actually drowned. Later on that, after they fished for him, and they finally found him. When they found him, they brought him out, and all the people on the dock was crying because because of him dying, and everybody was sad. And then the folks that ran the fish market came out and said, "Well, either you're going to work or you're going to leave. Either you work or you get off the dock." But a lot of people at that time, that was their income. That was their income, and they wasn't getting no more than 20 cents a bucket of shrimp. When you take your head off and you get a whole bucket and you only get 20 cents. But that was what we had. And speaking of what we had, whatever I had, my mother had, or the next family down the street had, we all had. Because everybody there in that community tried to look out for each other. The fishermen that went out on those boats every day, they'll try to give us fish. And everybody had a black, not everybody, but most of them in the backyard, they had a big black pot. And in that black pot, we would fill it with water and heat it up. And then they would cook, they'd put shrimp, crabs, all that stuff in it. And that's what we grew up on, a lot of seafood. Again, another incident in 1970, my cousin, Levi Keith, he graduated from Benedict College, and I met him and his fiance at that time, now his wife, Linda Keith, and they were at a club, and he had just got a new car, and he was really into cars, and he's actually the one that taught me how to drive. Levi did. And so he told me, he said, the next day, I want to take you for a ride in the car. He had a Bonneville. And I had a cousin that was standing by me, Larry Ward. And when Larry was standing there, I said, okay. But then another cousin came up, Larry Smalls, and he just got back from Vietnam. And he had bought a brand new car, And he wanted me to ride with him up to Chapee because he had some girls he was supposed to pick up. And so I made a choice. I was going with Levi and Linda. I was going with Larry and the girls, you know. And so we were going to meet at State Park. And that's Huntington State Park. When we got to Huntington, they were already in the water. While they were in the water, but my mother already told me that we not to go in the water because alligators, snakes, and stuff like that. And plus, she couldn't swim. They wouldn't let us learn how to swim because they didn't want us in the water. And then when I found out later what it really was, that during slavery, all of the houses where the slaves stayed were usually backed by water, and they'll tell you the same stories about alligators, snakes, so that you won't try to escape. And that carried over, and that's what kept us from learning. But Levi was a very good swimmer. And when we got there, I told him I wasn't going in the water, but Larry said that he was going. And I went and put some blanket down for the girls in the sand. And while I was there doing that, Larry came running back. And he said, there was 5 of them in the water. And he came running back and he said, would you believe, now he normally stuttered, but he spoke straight that day. He said, would you believe 4 of those guys got drowned? And I didn't believe him, but all of a sudden the alarm went off. And 4 of the 5 guys that I was supposed to have been with that day, they drowned. So the waters were good to us, but it caused us a lot of tragedy too. The ocean is, I think it's good. Ain't no doubt about it, it's good because, you know, from Maine to Miami, we also had the intracoastal waterway that came through here from Maine to Miami that they used to carry supplies. Slave was part of the supplies, but other stuff they would bring here. And the fishing industry, that was great. While we were in McClellanville, we saw all those shrimp boats. But when growing up here in Georgetown, there were hundreds of shrimp boats that would be out here every day. And on Wednesday was the big day when all the larger boats would be able to go out and fish for 2 or 3 days, then come back. Then we had a boat that they called Miss Betty. Miss Betty was probably the largest shrimp boat in the United States at that time. And they would go out and they could make their own ice. Everybody else had to go to the ice plant and get ice and bring it down and grind it up and then put it in a hole on the boat and then can get just enough to take out and bring back. But the rivers have been good to me. The river's been good to my family. I had a story that I couldn't tell about my uncle. He was one of the guys that I didn't mention it here, but he did shad season and sturgeon season, and he was one of the ones that they made a houseboat, and he made it out of the same slabs from the sawmill, and put it on a sled, and they would pull it out to the river where they had their nets anchored in the water, and then they would stay there on the houseboat, which was just on logs and a cabin, and they had a stove in there to try to keep warm, and and they would they did that, and then when the tide came down, where they were supposed to check their nets, they would check their nets, and they might come back that day, or they may come back the next day, but the river at that time was the way of life for us. That's what we ate, stuff that came from the river. The river did take a lot, but it gave a lot. My folks, my uncle, the story I was trying to tell a minute ago was like he worked on the shad boats, and what he did, like they would work all week and got paid on Friday, and on Saturday, 12 o'clock Saturday. And you want to know why I know? Because 12 o'clock Saturday, I would come down, he would come from Cthulhu, walking down the street. He got money now, see? My father was dead, and my cousins, Levi and Willie Joe, their father was dead. They died from TB. They had TB. My grandfather died from TB during that time. And he'd get paid at 12 o'clock, and one day I just happened to be walking down St. James Street. He was coming from out Cthulhu, and he said, "Boy, what you doing out here?" I said, "I'm just walking." He said, "Come here." And he gave me a quarter. Man, I was so happy. That was a lot of money, man, a quarter. And then, so where do you think I was the next week? The same street at the same time. And after about 3 weeks, 4 weeks, I told Levi. And so Levi, I said, but you can't be on the same block now. You got to be a block behind me. And we coming down, he saw me, come here, boy, give me a quarter. And then, what you doing back there, Levi? And he gave him a quarter. And Levi had another brother, Willie Joe. And when Willie Joe come up, he told Willie Joe, so he said, you got to be a block behind. I don't be in the same block, you know. We got this, and he would give us, all three of us, a quarter. And that was a lot of money during that time. And he made it off the rivers. I think of slaves and Gullah. The people came from Africa, West Africa, most of the slaves did, and then some came from other parts of Africa, and they had to communicate with each other. The communication, and they were all different languages. And when they brought it together, that was considered the Gullah Geechee. And then also, when you go, people in the slaves that went to New Orleans, they actually brought a lot of the Gullah back down to this area around Savannah first, I think. And then, like I said, we were going not the slave trade, but the rice fields were from Jackson, North Carolina, to Jacksonville, Florida. Yeah, and so that mean that Georgia's in between. So all those different places had to mix to try to get a language that they could understand, and that's where the Geechee when they got together, and then the New Orleans connection, all those got together, all those different languages, and they came up with the Gullah Geechee culture. Did I ever relate to Geechee? When we were growing up, we didn't hear Geechee, we heard Geech. When I went to school, everybody know Geech, but I never answered to other than John Smalls, so the name never stuck to me. But I had a cousin that lived over in South Island, right where we went over. He's off that plantation, and they called him Geech. He answered, so that was his name, but I wouldn't answer to names like that. I just John Smalls. But right now, if I say, hey, Geech, and then he's satisfied. And there was another guy up in Lincoln, where we went up from Lincoln High School, Clayton Thompson. He went to school with me, and he was called a Geech. Everybody from this area was a Geech except me, because I wouldn't answer to it, yeah.
I'm Johnny Weaver. I have been living in Pawleys Island since 1985. My profession is a real estate broker. I've been doing that since 1980. I've also been involved with the Wooden Boat Show, which sponsored the Maritime Museum. I'm one of the founding board members of the Maritime Museum and currently the president of the Harbor Historical Association. About 6 or 7 years ago, two friends and I decided to get our captain's license as a bucket list item. When I got my license, the school district superintendent heard about it and asked me to be the backup captain for the school bus boat for T.T. Tucker. T.T. has been doing it for 30 years. He lives on the island. He takes the children, he goes by and picks them up here, then takes the children over to the mainland to meet the school bus at 6:30 in the morning. He has never missed a day, and thankfully I have not had to be over here at 6:30 in the morning to get the children there by 6:30. Shortly after I became the backup captain, they received a grant to start a shuttle service for the residents and asked me if I would do that. Said if it doesn't interfere with my main job, that'll be fine. So I started as captain of the boat, running a shuttle service for the residents over here. At 8:30, I'm back at 9 in my office at 9:15. I do another one at 2 o'clock. And that's basically what I do. Operating the school boat started out as just a real adventure. I mean, it was something to get used to a boat that size and the way it's constructed. And I wasn't sure what to expect. I was the first off-island captain of the boat, and it took a while for everybody to kind of get used to me being on the boat. But after a few weeks, the ridership picked up. I have not, as I mentioned earlier, brought any of the children over for school. But I do come over, and at 9 o'clock, 8:30, I bring people over from the mainland to the island, and then get them back by 9 in order to catch the county bus to get to their different appointments and that type of thing. The people that I bring over are generally elderly people who do not want to run their own boats anymore or don't have any boats anymore. It's too dangerous for them. And they really appreciate being able to have specific times that they can count on to leave the island, to get on the mainland, take care of their business, and then come back 2 o'clock in the afternoon and have the boat bring them back home. And some days they are just loaded up with their groceries and different things that they bought. So that has been real helpful to them. And as one of them told me this morning, she said, we can't live without this boat now that we're used to it. The best thing about ferrying them to the island and back is getting to know them. Over the past, I've been doing this for about 6 years now, and I have gotten to know the people over here on the island. You could not ask for nicer, friendlier, more wonderful people than the people who live here on Sandy Island. They are not just passengers to me anymore. They are friends. They're like family. I have been, and my wife and I both have been invited to their Christmas luncheon over here. They treat both of us like family. When I was in the hospital several years ago, 3 of the children here, I know their parents, their grandparents, and their great-grandparents. The 3 children came and visited me twice in the hospital and have been in my home 2 times. And it's just a great friendship and something very satisfying to do.
My name is Laura Harriet, and I'm the owner of Wilma Cottage. I have people coming over for a day just to have a meal and a view of Sandy Island and the history of Wilma Cottage. I just want to come over for a night, and I'll give them a little history of Sandy Island, and I will feed them if they want to have meals. I'll prepare breakfast for them, lunch or dinner, and I'll give them a walk and show them the church and where I went to school at. Growing up and living in Island was different and very exciting because it was a lot of us here, and we did a bunch of stuff. We'd play hide and seek. We have baseball, basketball. We had a school. Growing up as a child, my grandmother raised me part of the time, and I lived with her for a while. Then I moved and came with my mother. And I had 9 brothers and sisters with a I was the youngest, so I mostly got all the good and the bad things because I was living with my grandmother, and I moved from a place called Georgia, and I came here, and then I had to learn what they were doing here, so it was like different. But anyway, going here, I went to school with about 75 other kids, and everybody got along. We didn't get to go on the other side unless somebody got sick or whatever. When we get in 7th grade, we went to Howard High School, so that was exciting. But when we did go to school, we all played together. But going back to the school, we had a spelling bee, and we were able to go to the spelling bee. And on my 2nd trip that I went, I missed the word spell split. And I guess I thought about it because we never really got to go out with the other kids, so it was a new environment for us. But we were very quiet, never got into much trouble at school because we was always trained, to be obedient. Even though we didn't have lights here, we would always know when we do our homework and our lessons. When we come from school, we had little chores like getting wood, getting water. I had a bad accident one time myself with the pump because I was rapid rushing to get the water, and the pump knocked me out. But through it all, I didn't even go to the doctor. But well, growing up, we didn't have electric light. We had lamp lights. But the lamp lights, and then the thing about most all the houses had a lot of windows in, so the windows helped the light in the daytime. And we know when to do our lessons. We would come home and get our work done before, and the lamp would, I guess it would be like the electric light to us in a sense, because I guess if you don't have something, you appreciate what you have. So without the electric, we still appreciate the lamp light and the God-given lights for us to see. Well, after I finished high school, I went to Columbia Commercial College in Columbia. Then my mother got sick and I came back and I stayed, and I didn't return. I didn't go back any place else. I'd go to Chicago and visit. But during the years, when I went to Columbia, it was a little different because I was able to move because I didn't have to worry about catching a boat to get across the river or anything. But I still always come back home because it was always peaceful, and I was more comfortable here because I didn't worry about any danger. Growing up on the island, the water did a lot because we could go fishing, we go swimming, and that was the only way we get on the other side. The water is a blessing because we don't have to communicate with anyone if we don't want to, and the only way they can communicate with us is to come through water. Then the other blessing is when we get across the water, come to our home, we'll feel so comfortable in insurance because we know nobody can intercede on us and that. But the only danger thing would be because we have to travel it and through the storm and the rain. I guess your home is always going to be your home, and a lot of people is home, just love their home, and they're going to come back. There's some that are never going to come back because someone's glad to get away, and there are some who's glad to get away when they get back and thinking, I could just stay where I was at. Things got better. Wilmer Cottage was given to me in a sense by my grandparents, and I didn't want to see it go down, so I decided to open it up to friends and family, and then it got to be a little bigger, and I had some difficulties with the roof was going down, and I had a fundraiser. Some people did that, and then I didn't have heat and air, and had a fundraiser for that, and I just enjoy it. I love people coming and serving them, and it's always open. Just call me and I'll be willing to work with you in any way when you come. For the church, I've always, when we started out, I said Sunday school. Then I joined the church. Then I sing on the choir, and after I left and came back, I'm a Sunday school teacher. I'm assistant superintendent. I'm the church custodian, and I also have over the little kids group. The church will always be here because it's the foundation, and we have people that will never, even they have left and lived in Georgetown, Paulazala, and Myrtle Beach, they come to church. So we have full service. Family reunion originally started with two cousins in Chicago, and she was doing the Harriet and Pyatt. And she moved here with it. They were just having like a barbecue. And then she decided, well, I'm going to go home and do something, Mary Pyatt, and she started it. And then I think a couple of years they decided and just went into Sandy Island reunion. Anybody from Sandy Island, anybody who paid money, even if y'all wants to come, y'all can come. It's just an open thing. And they have like a cookout and a dinner and church service. I learned to cook from my grandmother, looking at her. Then my sisters, them are older. And I always wanted, I guess I like red rice so much, so I just began. At first it didn't come out right, so I just kept trying and trying until I finally got it. So, and everybody, most every time somebody wants a meal prepared, they almost want me to have the red rice. Well, I identify myself as Gullah because I can't get away from it because after my four parents, that's how I came up Gullah. And what does it mean to me? You said, what does it mean to me? It means, I guess, inside a soul that will always be there. I would always follow the culture, most of it, and live through it.
My name is Vennie Days-Moore, and I was born in one part of the region of the Gullah Geechee or the Sea Island area. And basically I was born in McClellanville, South Carolina. And it took a minute for me to realize where I came from was very special. When I went to college, the different colleges I went to, then things started fitting together that we are a very unique culture. One reason, particularly my culture, was born on the Santee Delta. And through my studies at George Washington University, MUSC, and University of South Carolina, I realized we were a special culture, even though we were enslaved. We were brought to this area way back, I would say 16, 17, early 1800, for a reason. And the reason our culture was brought from the Green Coast of West Africa was because we were rice growers, specifically for this area. I'm not talking the whole entire Gullah Geechee strain, but particularly the Santee Delta strain. And when we got here, we were nothing but virgin swamp. What we were put into was virgin swamps. And it seemed odd, but guess where they took us from in the Green Coast of West Africa? The virgin swamps. So the uniqueness of our forefather compared to us, they took those virgin swamps and turned them into rice fields in the Green Coast of West Africa. Then somehow during the colonization period, I would say late 1700 into the early 1800, the colonists, who were mainly Western Europeans, decided that they want to colonize that delta, that swampland, what I call the Santee Delta, but they were very disappointed. Mainly they were very disappointed, well, how in the world are you going to build a country in a swamp? And people had been all over the world, all over Africa, and a lot of people get mistaken with Africa, what Africa is. Africa is, first of all, is a continent, it's not a country. And it has many countries in it. So this particular place they were going was the Green Coast of West Africa, and somehow they had communicated, because slavery doesn't mean slavages. Matter of fact, it's a verb, not a noun. These guys are rice growers. So they were actually enslaved out of West Africa and eventually brought here to this area of the wetlands, the virgin wetlands. And when they got here, I'd say it took them, and I don't want to take so much time about rice growing, but a lot of people don't understand the transition. Like somewhere like Sandy Island, they were placed here, and their duty is to change those virgin swamps into rice fields, and exactly what they did. And because of changing it to the rice fields into rice fields, their owners, which mainly were Western Europeans, got to be extremely wealthy, and therefore, and I always tell people this way because they still cannot understand the transition. When the Western Europeans went to get the Western Green Coast Africans, they brought one, the Africans, who are rice growers, number two, the African rice, and number three, I don't know, by mistake or whatever, they brought the African mosquito. And the African mosquito happened to have malaria from Africa. So even though the West Africans, like here in Sandy Island, knew their rice, but the people who bought them or bought them here as enslaved people, they couldn't even live on Sandy Island or the marshes around Sandy Island because they would die of malaria. What changes the story is emancipation. Because one planter, and I'm going to start talking about Sandy Island because thousands of West African rice growers were brought over, thousands, mainly to Georgetown County and Horry County. Emancipation Proclamation happened because one planter would own anywhere between 1,500 or 1,000 enslaved rice growers. So what does emancipation do to these guys, the owners? They're going to get broke. Because if they use these guys for rice growing, they're breaking the law. And we're now today, I must admit, I don't know when this is going to show, but we are celebrating this day, Juneteenth. That's part of that story, where Africans are freed and no longer slave. So the interesting thing with everything was a transition. I think what I'm most amazed, and every transition is somewhat different. One of the main transition here in Sandy Island, oh yeah, by the way, we're going to figure out, we're broke after the war. You know, we go through Emancipation Proclamation, we go through the war, the Civil War, and we have nothing. We, the planter, has nothing. So I can imagine one of the planter's wives said, honey, what in the world are we going to do now? We have no money after, it's against the law for us to enslave these rice growers. So you know what we're going to do? We're going to sell these lands to wealthy Northerners. What? Why would you sell all the swamp to wealthy Northerners? because they are going to make bird hunting clubs. The rice fields that we had built as West Africans that now we are free. Nobody, let me explain real quickly so people understand what this rice field is all about. It's puff mud. So when all these 1,000 people are taken away, we can't bring cows in here. We can't put tractors in here. Only hands and feet, 1,000 hands and feet. So you don't have 1,000 hands and feet. So that's what can wipe it out. So why in the world would you get wealthy Northerners? The birds were flying around all the time, by the way. They were a nuisance earlier. But when they come in, like the Huntingtons, by the way, they're ones that would be coming in as bird hunters from the north. They're going to totally, this was a haven for migratory birds. And all the time when I think about and I'm saying Northerners because Barus were not Northerners. When I say Northern, I mean a style of culture or style of occupation. When they come into these rice fields, guess what they do? Like you go into a hotel and somebody buys your hotel out. What do they do with that hotel? Change the color of the wall. That's it. These rice fields were already perfect design for migratory birds. And people like the Huntingtons, and I must take my hat off to them, they did more than just made bird hunting club. They made amazing gardens. And the people that were laid off for rice growing end up being hired to help the Huntingtons build their gardens. By the time me, the planter, loses my possibility of having these rice fields, it's on high ground. Everything is going great. But that emancipation taking 1,000 workers from me that work in the swamp mud, that's crashed it. Now, as far as it going out, I always said, no, it's not going, no, it's getting higher. But again, a lot of people, and I have this all the time when I talk about people about slavery. Slavery is not a job. It's enforced labor. So you have somebody that you enforce or enslaving, or I think the best word I could come up was enforced labor. Are you going to turn around and hire them? No, because you never had them in that position in the beginning. Matter of fact, in a lot of our early history book, it was told to us that these people were savages, which, as I just told you, they were not savages, they were rice growers. So I don't believe, not say there was not some affection, I do know there is some attachment back and forth to this population of enslaved cultures. But no, that was not, life don't turn over that fast. And I think with what we're going through Juneteenth, we'll find out that life took 3 years. Life don't turn over overnight. And who's going to benefit? Not the people who are being punished or mistreated. I hope that answers that to you. And I think the only saving grace was the Northerners coming in, giving them jobs where they didn't have the same mentality of having an enslaved culture. And I think in some ways they did feel like they did, but not to the extent that the Southerners thought they had enslaved cultures. And I'm going to put one little sweet dime on here. They were planters or Europeans that became family members or the Africans became family members to them. So there was not all never touch me or never become my family. That was a kind of mix up in that. And I'm hoping I'm not going too deep into the X zone. But people end up marrying each other, not marrying, but becoming family. I'll put the word there. So there was that connection, but it was more of that connection versus, oh my goodness, I'm finally going to treat them like the best workers I've ever had, and I'm going to start paying them. I don't think that ever came to be. That swamp rice is pretty much gone, except for the nice Africans that want to continue to grow that rice. But from that, our next stage of rice growing is going to be the bank rice. Totally different from the African rice. So that's where you're going to see the hype, is the bank rice. The swamp rice is going down, 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 because the only way that could be grown is in swamp. And I always tell people, I got to make one joke in this. One joke in this, so it wouldn't seem, I didn't mean to be so heavy. But one joke, and I went out to Tranquility with one of the rice fields, because every rice field has a name, but one rice field is about the size of a football field. So Dr. Poche was doing some research and figuring out how these rice fields are grown. So he takes me out in the puff mud, and I almost drowned in it. And he told me to lay flat on my stomach so he could drag me out with a cane, because there's a lot of cane plants out there. Drag me out with a cane so I wouldn't die. And I went and told my mother, which used to be a rice grower. I said, Mom, guess what? I was out in Tranquility today. She said, you were where? I said, in Tranquility. And she said, don't you ever tell me again you ever go back out there again, because you can die out there. Do you know we lost whole cows out there? How dangerous it is to be in a swamp? We've lost whole cows. So it wasn't a great place to be, even if you're getting paid. Sandy Island seems to be a world apart. A world apart in several ways. One, the way we get here is only by boat. And the second is how much Sandy Island have maintained through generations. Even with me, last time I was here was 20 years ago in my research. By the way, I did my research here for about 5 years. And then about 10 years later, I come back. And then I see it again. And then another 10 years, I come back and I see it again. It amazes me how the Sandy Islanders can hold on to their customs and their traditions. And I guess you said, well, you know, that anybody could build a house, anybody could do this. But when it really hit me in my face that Sandy Islanders are keeping up with tradition, is when I went to Africa. I went to the Grain Coast of Africa in Guinea. And I knew the way these houses were built were different. Not even like McClellan. They built the dimension, the demographics. It's all different. And then I go to Guinea. I go into the tribal village of Guinea. Guess what? Their huts, not houses, sometimes you'll call them, are the dimension or the demographics is the same. That's saying all this. These Sandy Islanders have not lost a lot what they brought from Africa. And that's from the way they build their villages or their homes on Sandy Island, to the way they cook red rice, okra, the way they speak, the way they have kinship. That's African. And one thing else that people don't realize, we have gone back to, a lot of people don't know this, I got a secret to tell you. We went back to Africa after the rice growing was over. You ever hear of Sierra Leone and all those places? That was the New Africa. And when we went to the New Africa, Sierra Leone, we brought that gullah back. So the people that are African in Sierra Leone, the new country, are speaking Gula, which is again another version of our gullah. But they were African returning back to Africa, enslaved Africans returning back to Africa after emancipation. We all did not stay here. And we created another country called Sierra Leone.